The sun had just begun to dip behind the hills, casting a golden hue over the farm, and Sarah stood by the edge of the field, watching the crops sway in the breeze, her mind racing with everything that had happened over the past few weeks. It was supposed to be a quiet place, a peaceful sanctuary, away from the noise of the city. But everything had changed the moment the HOA had gotten involved. The letters had started to arrive, first a few warnings about small things she could fix, then more severe complaints about things she had no idea were even issues at all. The grass was too tall, the barn was an eyesore, the animals were too loud. Each complaint seemed more ridiculous than the last. But it didn't stop them from sending more and more, and demanding immediate action. At first, she tried to ignore them, thinking it was just another overzealous group. But when they showed up in person, things escalated quickly. It was Karen, the head of the HOA, and her entourage of volunteers. Sarah had heard rumors about Karen before she was known to have a certain reputation in town, a reputation for getting things done whether they needed to be done or not. She smiled in the most insincere way as she approached Sarah's farm and began listing off everything she deemed unacceptable: the overgrown grass, the dilapidated fence, the chickens running free. It was clear Karen wasn't just doing her job, she was taking pleasure in this. Every word felt like a personal attack. The tone in her voice was sharp and cutting, and Sarah could see the glee in Karen's eyes as she went on and on, listing every tiny flaw in the place. Sarah took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. She knew that engaging in an argument would only make things worse, but Karen wasn't finished. She pulled out a clipboard from her bag and started taking notes, as if Sarah's entire life was a checklist she had to mark off item by item. Sarah had had enough. She had tried to be nice and polite, but this was crossing a line. Without thinking, she grabbed the clipboard out of Karen's hands and tossed it onto the grass. Karen looked at her in shock, her mouth agape. Sarah could see the wheels turning in Karen's mind as she processed what had just happened. Karen tried to speak, but Sarah cut her off. "The farm is my home. I've worked for everything I have here. I don't need you or anyone telling me how to run it. And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you regret it." Karen's face turned bright red, and for a moment Sarah thought she might explode. But instead, Karen stood there silent, her arms crossed, glaring at Sarah, as if trying to figure out what to do next. Without saying another word, she turned and marched off the property, followed by her entourage. Sarah stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, feeling the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't let it go that easily, but Sarah wasn't about to back down. She had worked too hard for this place, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. She had no idea what the HOA would do next, but one thing was certain: they had no idea what they were about to unleash. The next few days were tense. Sarah kept a close eye on the mailbox, expecting more letters from the HOA, but none arrived. Instead, she found herself pacing the house, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest every time she thought about Karen and the look on her face when she stormed off the property. Sarah knew Karen wouldn't let it slide so easily. She was the type of person who never backed down, and Sarah could already feel the storm brewing. She wasn't sure when it would hit, but she was certain it would, and when it did, it would be worse than anything she had already endured. One morning, as Sarah was out feeding the animals, she heard the unmistakable hum of a car engine approaching. She froze, knowing instantly who it was. She turned just in time to see a black SUV pulling up the dirt road toward her house. It was Karen, and she wasn't alone. Behind her car was a truck packed with supplies. Sarah could see paint buckets and bags of cement, all the tools they needed to make changes to the property. She had hoped for peace, but it seemed that hope was gone. Karen stepped out of the SUV with her arms crossed and that smug smile plastered across her face. She looked over at Sarah standing in the doorway of the barn, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Sarah's heart raced, but she refused to be intimidated. "Not again." Karen finally spoke, her voice sharp and cold. "We are here to fix the problems you've been ignoring." Sarah felt a surge of anger flood her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but Karen didn't give her a chance. She raised a hand and nodded to her crew, who began unloading the supplies. Without a word, Sarah stood frozen in place as they began painting the barn and fixing the fence. She couldn't believe what was happening. They weren't just criticizing her property, they were taking control of it. They were changing things without asking, without permission. Karen didn't care about her rights or her feelings. She was bulldozing her way through everything Sarah had worked for. Sarah stepped forward, her feet heavy on the gravel. She marched up to Karen and confronted her directly. Enough is enough, Karen. This is my home, and you have no right to do this. Karen smirked and turned slowly, as if Sarah's words didn't matter. She didn't even look her in the eye when she replied, I do have the right. Actually, the HOA gives me the power to make sure your property is up to standard. And I'm making sure it is, whether you like it or not. Sarah's anger boiled over, but she knew she couldn't just yell at Karen. That would play right into her hands. She had to be smarter than that. Instead, she took a deep breath and made a decision. She would fight this legally. She wasn't going to let Karen and the HOA ruin her farm. They'd wanted to force her out. They'd wanted to make her feel small. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. She had a plan, and she was going to make it work. She turned on her heel and walked back into the house, her mind already racing with how she would turn this around. She was done being passive. She was done being silent. It was time to fight back against the HOA and everything they represented. Sarah spent the next few days gathering information. She researched local laws about property rights and HOA regulations, poring over every detail she could find. She knew that Karen and the HOA couldn't just do whatever they wanted, but she had to be sure she understood her rights before she confronted them again. Each night, she stayed up late reading legal documents, making phone calls to lawyers, and taking notes on anything that could help her build a case. She wasn't going to let them steamroll her again. This time, she would be prepared. But the more she learned, the more she realized how deep the HOA's influence ran. They had connections with local officials, and it seemed like they were above the law. They had the power to impose fines for every minor infraction, and if you didn't comply, the consequences could be severe. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she wasn't ready to give up, not yet. One evening, Sarah drove into town to meet with a lawyer she had found online, someone who had experience dealing with HOAs. The office was small and tucked between two buildings on a quiet street. She walked in with a sense of both hope and dread. The lawyer, a man named Mark, greeted her with a firm handshake and invited her to sit down. She explained the situation to him, from the letters to Karen's arrival on her property. Mark listened, intently taking notes as she spoke. When she was finished, he leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. Well, it sounds like you've got a case, but I'll warn you, it's going to be tough. HOAs have a lot of power, and they don't like losing battles like this. Sarah nodded, her stomach sinking. But I'm not going to back down, she said. I've worked too hard for this place, and they can't just take it from me. Mark smiled slightly. I admire your determination, he said, but it's going to take time and money to fight this. The HOA won't give up easily. They'll try to drag it out as long as they can, but I'll help you every step of the way, he promised. Sarah left the office that evening with mixed feelings. She was relieved to have a lawyer on her side, but she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It felt like she was fighting not just for her farm, but for something much bigger, a chance to stand up to people like Karen who thought they could control everything. She drove back home in a daze, her mind spinning with everything that lay ahead. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let Karen win. She wouldn't let the HOA destroy her home and her future, and she would do whatever it took to fight for what was rightfully hers. The following week, Sarah received a letter from the HOA. It wasn't a typical warning. This one was more serious, a formal notice that she had violated several codes and would be fined unless immediate repairs were made. Sarah opened the envelope, her hands trembling, as she scanned the list of supposed infractions. They claimed her barn was an eyesore, the fence was unsafe, and the grass was too tall. It all felt like an attack, a way to force her into submission. She slammed the letter down on the kitchen table and took a deep breath. She had been expecting this. She knew Karen and the HOA wouldn't stop until they had pushed her to the edge. But now, it was getting personal. Sarah knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let them win. She had to fight back with everything she had. The next day, she met with Mark again. He reviewed the letter carefully and frowned. They're getting more aggressive, he said. This isn't just about the farm anymore. They're trying to break you. Sarah felt a lump in her throat, but she nodded determinedly. I won't let them. Mark's advice was clear. She needed to start documenting everything from now on, every conversation, every letter, every visit from Karen or anyone associated with the HOA. It was a tedious task, but Sarah knew it was necessary. She began keeping a journal logging every interaction and taking pictures of her property to prove its condition. Each time the HOA tried to impose another demand, Sarah added to the growing pile of evidence. She had started to build a case, one that she hoped would hold up in court. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. It wasn't just the legal battle that weighed on her. It was the feeling of being constantly watched. She could feel Karen's presence. Even when she wasn't around, Sarah would glance out her window and see the neighbors staring or hear the sounds of footsteps on her property. She knew the HOA was orchestrating a quiet campaign to wear her down. It was a form of intimidation, a way to make her feel isolated and alone. But Sarah wasn't backing down. The more they pushed, the harder she pushed back. She began reaching out to others in the community, anyone who had ever dealt with the HOA, and wasn't afraid to speak up. She heard stories from other homeowners who had been bullied into compliance, people who had lost their homes or been forced to make expensive repairs because of the HOA's demands. She realized how widespread the problem was and how much power the HOA had over people's lives. She wasn't the only one struggling against this system, but she was determined to be the one who fought back the hardest. Sarah's resolve only grew stronger as the days wore on. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. She wouldn't be silenced. She wouldn't let the HOA take away everything she had worked so hard for. The fight was far from over. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She was prepared to face Karen and the HOA head-on and show them that they couldn't just bully her out of her own life. A few days later, the tension on the farm grew thicker as Sarah noticed more and more signs of the HOA's presence. They weren't just sending letters anymore. They were making their presence felt in ways that were harder to ignore. One afternoon, Sarah spotted a couple of HOA members taking pictures of her barn from the edge of her property. They didn't even attempt to hide what they were doing. It was a clear attempt at intimidation. Sarah marched outside, her feet crunching on the gravel. As she made her way toward them, the two members looked up startled, but quickly regained their composure. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she approached. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice steady, but with a trace of anger. "We're just doing our job," one of them said. The other added, "We're documenting the violations." Sarah didn't say a word. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She started snapping pictures of them, taking pictures of her. She knew they wouldn't like it, but she didn't care. It was her farm, and they had no right to invade her privacy. Without warning, the two members exchanged uncomfortable glances and began to walk away, not saying another word. Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. She had taken back a little control, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The fight was far from over. Over the next weeks, Sarah spent hours talking to her lawyer, Mark. As he helped her prepare her case, they went over every piece of evidence she had gathered and strategized how they could best present it in court. Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. As they talked, the more they went over the information, the clearer it became that the HOA was acting outside the law. They had no legal grounds for some of their demands, and their tactics were becoming more and more questionable. But Sarah also knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Mark warned her that even with the evidence, it could take months or even years for a resolution. The HOA had deep pockets and the resources to drag things out as long as they wanted. But Sarah was determined. She was prepared for a long battle. Whatever it took, she would fight for her farm and for her right to live without fear of being pushed around by people who had no understanding of what it meant to work for something. Sarah felt her resolve harden as the days went on. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced her worst fear and survived. Now she was ready to take the next step in the fight against the HOA. The next time Karen showed up at her door, she wouldn't just stand there and take it. She would be ready. She would face Karen and the HOA head-on and show them that they couldn't bully her into submission. But as Sarah prepared for what was to come, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Karen had been quiet for a while, and Sarah knew it wouldn't last much longer. It was only a matter of time before the next round began. And this time, she wouldn't be caught off guard. She was ready for whatever Karen had in store. The following week, the calm before the storm was shattered when Sarah received another letter from the HOA. It was more aggressive than any of the previous ones. This time, they threatened to take her to court if she didn't make immediate changes to her property. The letter outlined several new infractions that had appeared seemingly overnight. The list included things she had never even heard of before, like the positioning of her fence posts and the height of the barn roof. Sarah's hands shook. As she read through the letter, she had expected more of the same, but this was different. The tone was harsher and more demanding, and she could feel the weight of their power pressing down on her. They wanted to break her, they wanted to force her into submission and make her bow to their will. Sarah stared at the letter for what felt like hours, trying to come to terms with what she was reading, but her mind was racing. The more she read, the angrier she became. She wasn't going to let them win, not like this. She wasn't going to give in. She called Mark immediately and explained the situation to him. He listened carefully and then gave her the advice she was expecting. "This is getting serious," he said. "But you're not out of options, Sarah. You have the right to contest their demands. And if you think they're acting in bad faith, we can take legal action." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline run through her at Mark's words. She had been preparing for this moment. She had been gathering her evidence, and now it was time to use it. "They can't just bully me into submission," she thought to herself. She had worked too hard for this place too long to let them take it away from her. Sarah and Mark worked late into the night, preparing their response. They went through every document, carefully putting together a clear and solid argument for why the HOA was wrong. They used the law to their advantage, citing property rights and HOA regulations that were supposed to protect homeowners, not tear them down. Sarah felt a sense of pride as she signed the letter that would go out the next day. This was her fighter stand against the system that had been bullying her, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The next few days felt like an eternity as Sarah waited for a response from the HOA. She kept checking her mailbox every morning and pacing her porch in the afternoons, as if that would make the letter arrive faster. She knew the HOA wouldn't back down easily, but she had no idea how far they were willing to go to win. Sarah tried to stay focused on her work, but the anxiety was always there, gnawing at the back of her mind. Every knock on the door, every car that drove down her dirt road made her jump in anticipation. But no word came for days. Then late one afternoon, she saw a car pulled up to her farm, a black SUV that she recognized immediately. Karen stepped out and walked toward her with that smug look on her face. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. But this time she was ready. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let Karen win this time. The battle was just beginning, and Sarah wasn't going to let anything stop her. Karen approached with the same confident stride she always had, but this time Sarah stood her ground in the doorway of her home, arms crossed, her gaze steady. As Karen drew closer, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She knew this was the moment it would all come to a head. Karen stopped just short of the porch and smiled, that same insincere smile Sarah had come to hate so much. Sarah took a deep breath and spoke first. "I've sent my response to the HOA, Karen," she said. "I'm not going to make the changes you're demanding. I'm not going to back down." Karen's smile faltered for a moment, but only briefly. She quickly regained her composure and tilted her head slightly. "Well, that's unfortunate," she said, "because the HOA isn't going to let this go. They've already begun the process of filing a lawsuit against you. They don't take kindly to resistance." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had expected something like this, but hearing it from Karen's mouth made it feel more real. She knew the HOA had the power to drag things out for years, but she was ready to fight. She wasn't going to let them push her around anymore. Karen's voice turned sharper as she continued, "I suggest you start packing up and preparing to move out of here, Sarah. There's no way you'll win this fight, not against the full force of the HOA." Sarah's anger flared, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm not going anywhere, Karen, and if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you or the HOA take my home, you're wrong." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't back down. Instead, she simply turned and walked back toward her car. Without saying another word, Sarah watched her go, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She had made it clear she wasn't going to let Karen intimidate her, but she knew this was just the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to let up. They would keep pushing her. They would keep finding ways to make her life miserable. But Sarah was ready. She had the law on her side and the support of her lawyer, and now she had made it clear to Karen that she wasn't afraid anymore. Sarah spent the next few days preparing herself for the legal battle she knew was coming. She continued to document everything, making sure to gather as much evidence As she spent hours researching case law and talking to experts in property rights to make sure she was as prepared as possible. She even reached out to a few neighbors who had experienced similar issues with the HOA, hoping they might be willing to testify on her behalf. Sarah knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed all the support she could get. But no matter how many hours she spent working or how many calls she made, she couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was going to take everything she had. It would test her in ways she had never imagined. But she was determined to win no matter what it took. She would fight for her farm and for the right to live her life on her own terms, and she wouldn't stop until she had won. Days turned into weeks as Sarah immersed herself in the battle. She was preparing for the legal fight of her life. Every morning, she woke up with a new sense of determination. But the weight of it all was beginning to wear on her. She barely slept anymore, her mind constantly running through what was next, who she needed to call, what documents still needed to be gathered. The constant anxiety gnawed at her. But she kept going. She couldn't afford to stop, not now, not when everything was on the line. One morning, as Sarah was working in the barn, she saw a familiar black SUV pull up again. Karen stepped out with her usual smug look on her face. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her were two other people in suits. Sarah immediately recognized them as legal representatives. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Karen wasn't just here to intimidate. She had brought in the big guns to make sure Sarah knew just how serious this had become. Sarah's stomach churned, but she stood tall, walking out to meet them. The three of them stood on the edge of her property, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air as Karen smiled, that cold smile of hers. "We've got a team of lawyers now," she said. "The HOA is not going to lose this fight, and neither are we." Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "I'm not backing down," she replied with conviction. Karen glanced at her lawyers, who nodded slightly before looking back at Sarah. "If you don't settle this quickly, it's going to get ugly," Karen said. "We're prepared to take this to court and drag it out for as long as we need to. You're going to lose, Sarah. You know that, right?" Sarah's mind raced, but she didn't show it. She could feel her resolve strengthening. "I'm not scared of you, Karen," she said. "I've done my research, I know my rights, and I'm ready to fight back." Karen's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered and turned to her lawyers. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then looked at Sarah again. "You'll regret this," Karen said coldly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't flinch. "You don't scare me," she replied. The three of them turned and started walking back to their SUV. Sarah stood there watching them leave, her chest tight with the weight of what was coming. She knew the fight was only going to get harder, but she was ready for whatever they threw at her. The next few days were filled with meetings with Mark the lawyer. He was a constant presence in her life, now giving her advice and reassurance every time she felt overwhelmed. He helped her refine her strategy as the legal process began to ramp up. She knew it wasn't going to be a quick or easy win, but with each passing day, she grew more and more confident that she had made the right decision. It wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up for herself and her right to live without fear of being trampled on by people like Karen and the HOA. Every letter that came from the HOA made her feel more resolute. Every legal document she reviewed made her more certain that this was a fight worth having. She wasn't just fighting for her property, she was fighting for her freedom. As the days dragged on, Sarah felt herself becoming more entrenched in the battle. The constant flow of paperwork and legal meetings weighed on her, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now, not when everything was on the line. She spent countless hours meeting with Mark, refining their strategy and building their case. The more they worked, the more they discovered about the HOA's underhanded tactics. They had been getting away with this kind of behavior for years, and it was time to expose them. Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to hold them accountable for their actions. She wasn't going to let Karen and the HOA push her around any longer. One evening, as Sarah was sitting at her kitchen table going over documents, she heard a car pull up outside. She glanced out the window and saw a familiar black SUV. It was Karen again. Sarah's heart sank, but she was done feeling scared this time. She wouldn't back down. She walked outside to meet Karen, who was already standing at the foot of her porch with a smug look on her face. Well, Karen said, "It seems like you're really committed to this fight. You think you can win against us." Sarah looked her straight in the eye and said without hesitation, "I know I can win, Karen. You're not as untouchable as you think. You've been bullying people for too long." And it ends now. Karen's face twisted into a sneer. But she didn't respond right away. Instead, she motioned to the two people standing behind her, the lawyers Sarah had seen earlier. They stepped forward, holding a thick stack of papers. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" she asked calmly. Karen's lawyer spoke up. "These are the official papers for the lawsuit, Sarah. We're giving you one last chance to settle before we take this to court." Karen may have a lot of power, but I'm not going to let her or the HOA control me, Sarah replied. "This is my farm, and I'm not selling out for anyone." Karen scoffed and folded her arms. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. She motioned for her lawyers to leave and turned to walk back to her SUV. But before she could get in, she paused and turned back to Sarah. "I just hope you realize that this fight is going to cost you more than you can afford," Karen said, her tone sharp. "You're going to lose everything." Sarah's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She watched as Karen got into her car and drove off, her words echoing in Sarah's mind. But they didn't have the effect Karen wanted. Sarah wasn't scared anymore. She was more determined than ever. This wasn't just a fight for her farm. It was a fight for her right to stand up to bullies and not be afraid to speak out. She went inside and grabbed her phone, calling Mark to let him know what had happened. They would need to adjust their strategy slightly now that they knew the HOA was preparing for a full-blown lawsuit. But Sarah wasn't worried. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she was ready. She had come too far to back down now. She knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but she was more determined than ever to win. The weeks following the encounter with Karen were the hardest Sarah had faced yet. The lawsuit had been filed, and the legal proceedings were officially underway. Sarah felt the weight of it all as she sat in the lawyer's office, staring at stacks of papers that seemed to grow by the day. The pressure was overwhelming, but she didn't give up. Mark was by her side every step of the way, offering support and guidance. As they prepared for the upcoming court dates, it was clear that the HOA wasn't going to let go of this fight easily. They had all the resources and the power to drag things out as long as they could, but Sarah had something they didn't have. She had the truth on her side, and she was willing to fight with everything she had. She spent every free moment working on her case, collecting more evidence and reviewing every legal document she could find. She had to be perfect if she was going to stand a chance against the HOA and Karen. But despite the mounting pressure, Sarah found herself feeling a sense of strength that she hadn't known she had. She had started this journey uncertain and afraid, but now she knew she had the power to stand up for what was right. Sarah attended the first hearing with Mark by her side, and as they sat in the courtroom waiting for the proceedings to begin, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The room was filled with the sound of shuffling papers and murmurs of conversation. But Sarah kept her focus on the task at hand. She wasn't there to back down. She was there to fight. The HOA and Karen had underestimated her, and now they were going to feel the full weight of her resolve. When the judge entered the room, the atmosphere shifted, and everything went silent. Sarah's heart raced, but she took a deep breath and steadied herself. She was ready. She knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but she had already come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The hearing began, and Sarah listened intently as her lawyer presented their case. Every piece of evidence they had worked so hard to gather was being laid out in front of the judge. Sarah felt a growing sense of hope as she saw how the case was shaping up. It was clear that the HOA had crossed several lines in their attempts to force her to comply with their demands. But they weren't giving up without a fight. They tried to discredit her evidence and twist the facts, but Sarah wasn't intimidated. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to let them spin the narrative in their favor. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself growing more confident. Every argument from the HOA felt weaker and weaker, and she knew they were losing ground, but she couldn't let herself relax. She knew there were still many hurdles ahead, and this fight wasn't over yet. As the hearing wrapped up and the judge called for a break, Sarah sat back in her seat feeling exhausted, but determined. She had given it everything she had, and she wasn't going to stop until she won this battle. The next few months were a blur of legal proceedings, meetings with Mark, and long nights spent reviewing the case. But Sarah never wavered. She knew this was the fight of her life, and she was going to see it through no matter what. When the final decision came, and the judge ruled in her favor, Sarah's heart soared. She had won the battle she had fought for her farm, her freedom, and her right to live without fear. She couldn't believe it. The fight had been long and hard. But she had done it. She had beaten the HOA and Karen, and she had proven that no matter how powerful they seemed, no one could take away what was rightfully hers.